Good evening. On behalf of Gonzaga University's Faith and Reason Institute and its executive board, I welcome you to the third of 4 lectures in our 2013 Biology and the God of Abraham series. I'm Dr. Brian Clayton, Director of the Institute and Associate Professor of Philosophy at Gonzaga. And before I forget, my boss asked me to say that if anyone didn't get a copy of the program brochure, there are copies available over here on the way out. In introducing the previous 2 lectures in this series, I've indicated that the series itself is part of the Catholic Intellectual Tradition Project, a program initiative we began in the spring of 2011. We conceive of this project as one that preserves, extends, and makes available to a wider audience the rich intellectual tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. It is a living intellectual tradition that has long promoted the integration of faith and reason, a tradition that both nurtures and challenges our Institute. Thus, the Institute offers occasional lectures and programs that seek to celebrate and contribute to the life of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in the Wolf Auditorium in Jepson Center, Dr. Chris Baglow of Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans will give the talk that concludes this year's series, a talk entitled The Pilgrim's Guide to the Galaxy, Learning the Levels of Being and the Paths of Knowing in Faith and Science. Also this week, the Institute is sponsoring a talk by Dr. Catherine Tkach, Nunin Pist, Prayers in Nez Perce. This talk arises from Dr. Tkach's work that has made available to the Nez Perce some of the hymns prepared for them by Father Cataldo. These hymns have been largely lost to the Nez Perce people, but Dr. Tkach's work, supported by the Institute, has given them back to the tribe in written form. Dr. Tkach's talk will be given this Saturday at 10 a.m. in Bishop White Seminary across the street from the university, and we invite you to attend. Tonight's lecture, however, focuses once again on biology. In the first lecture of this series, Dr. William Carroll explained the traditional Thomistic understanding of creation as referring fundamentally to a relation of ontological dependence rather than to an event that happened in the past. He then drew out the implications of this understanding for modern neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory and biology. The argument was that there is no incompatibility between creation, so understood, and evolutionary theory. Thus, it addressed the contention that traditional Christian theism is somehow incompatible with modern science, especially modern biology. Dr. Carroll followed up his Thursday evening lecture with a Socratic Club presentation on Friday, in which he drew out the implications for contemporary cosmology of this Thomistic understanding of creation. Again, he argued that nothing in contemporary cosmology is incompatible with St. Thomas's account of creation. Thus, neither modern biology nor contemporary cosmology has disproven creation and the need for a creator, nor can they do so. The second lecture in the series was given last evening by Dr. Michael Tkach. In his talk, Dr. Tkach addressed the frequently made claim that modern science, especially neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, has shown that there is no purpose or meaning in nature. Dr. Tkach reintroduced us to the Aristotelian account of natural teleology, especially as developed by Aristotle's medieval successors, Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas. He then showed us that this notion of natural teleology is very much alive in the research programs of contemporary evolutionary biologists. Thus, modern science has not disposed of Aristotelian final causes, natural teleology, and purpose. Tonight's lecturer will consider a third challenge that modern neo-Darwinian evolutionary history has been taken to pose for traditional Christian theism. It is the claim that there is nothing about Homo sapiens that especially distinguishes our species from all other organisms on the planet. For Jews and Christians, human beings are distinct by being made imago Dei, in the image of God. The challenge to human distinctiveness was laid down by Darwin himself in The Descent of Man, when he proposed to show that, quote, there is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties, unquote. That is, Whatever differences there are between humans and other animals are differences in degree, not differences in kind. Quantitative differences, not qualitative differences. He then proceeded to examine a number of human mental capacities and to show how these exist in some degree or other in other mammals. Implicit in this argument is that the differences on these points between mammals and other classes of animals are, in turn, simply a matter of degree. Now, that there are no qualitative differences among living things, in particular between human beings and all other species, seems so obviously false that one wonders that this idea gained any traction. After all, there is a huge qualitative difference between organisms that can fly and those that cannot. Accumulate enough quantitative differences, and sure enough, qualitative difference emerges. But there it is. The claim remains. Human beings differ only in degree, not in kind, from their fellow organisms. This seems to be an example of what C.S. Lewis called the fatal serialism of modern imagination, where each step in a process is thought to be qualitatively indistinct from any and all that have gone before it. Each step is just one more step, and no steps are sui generis. This might be an issue of interest only to those who specialize in the philosophy of science, the philosophy of biology, or metaphysics, if it weren't for the fact that the claim that there are differences only in degree and not in kind would seem to have practical, moral implications. If claims about a special human dignity are based in part on the existence of something distinctive about human beings, and if there is nothing distinctive about human beings, then it would seem that human beings have no special dignity attached to them. In its lowest common denominator form, the claim would be that human dignity is simply the same as that shared by all other living things, if such dignity there be. Our speaker tonight has thought about and written on this subject for several years. Since 1989, Dr. David Calhoun has taught at Gonzaga University, where he is an associate professor of philosophy. Dr. Calhoun's undergraduate degree is from Louisiana State University, and his master's and doctorate are from Northwestern University. He has varied academic interests ranging from ancient philosophy, philosophy of human nature, and existentialism, to Christianity and science, philosophy of education, and philosophical reflection on popular film. I've been privileged not only to be Dr. Calhoun's colleague and friend, but also to team teach with him courses in philosophy of human nature, Christian existentialism, and, this upcoming summer, philosophy and film. Among the titles of his publications, one will find Can Human Beings Be Friends with God? Prospects for Human Dignity Before and After Darwin, tonight. And From Solitary Individualism to Post-Christian Stoic Existentialism, Quest for Community, Moral Agency, and Transcendence in the Films of Clint Eastwood. Dr. Calhoun also has an impressive list of conference presentations and invited lectures to his credit. On a more personal note, Dr. Calhoun and I also share the common bond of having a deep love for the works of Walter Percy and of being from the South. From Dr. Calhoun, I've come to realize that Southerners from Alabama don't always agree in the pronunciation with Southerners from Louisiana. But we and Southerners of every stripe would almost certainly agree that the Southern y'all is superior to any of its regional alternatives, especially the New Jerseyite use guys. Dr. Calhoun's topic tonight is Darwin, Human Distinctiveness, and Human Dignity. Y'all please join me in welcoming Dr. David Calhoun.
Thank you, Brian. Wonderful introduction. I appreciate very much. He said I've been thinking about and writing about these topics for a few years now, and it's true that I've only published something in the last couple of years. But it's fair to say that I've been thinking about these things since Dr. Clayton and I began teaching human nature it's lost in the mist of history, sometime in the early 1990s. And we went to an online format by the late 1990s. But we've been teaching human nature. And really the question that I'm addressing in this talk tonight, I'm very excited about. In a way, I'm overly excited. Sorry, I don't know if you can tell that from my demeanor, but I'm very excited about this because it's a central question to our human nature course. It's a central question that I think concerns students when they begin to reflect on the traditional conception of human beings. How do we think about the relationship between human beings and animals, especially in the wake of Darwin? That's really the question that I want to ask. In fact, it's my subtitle on the presentation, but in a way I could say it's really the central title. I am going to frame this in terms of the concept of human dignity, which is a very important concept in contemporary ethics. But my interest is really driven by Gonzaga's curriculum and the course Philosophy of Human Nature. What I want to do, as Dr. Clayton's already suggested, I want to defend, this is kind of a funny subject for a talk. I'm going to defend two intuitive claims that I think all of us know are true. Isn't that a strange project for a presentation? I want to defend what I'm going to call the continuity thesis that humans are similar to animals in significant ways. Wow, that's really controversial, isn't it? Secondly, I want to defend the discontinuity thesis that humans are different from animals in significant ways. Wow, I can already see you falling asleep. I might as well demonstrate that 2 + 2 = 4, right? What I want to do, though, I have a task in front of me. Because these are common sense, intuitive claims, I want to show in the course of this talk why they're problematic, why they're controversial, and to make clear why it's important to both defend them and also to clarify what they mean and what their implications are. I also want to do a little bit of history of ideas. That's one of my shortcomings, is I end up wanting to do way too much history of ideas, so I'm going to have to truncate some of the stuff that I was likely to say. But I want to show how in history, often one of the two claims has been asserted against the other. Although if you'll notice, the statements, while they're in tension, they're not contradictories. We're talking about similarity, right? It is possible for a thing to both be similar to another thing and dissimilar to that thing. That's the argument that I'm going to be making here. Now, I want to, so far I've just put it in terms of obvious intuitiveness, but I also want to point out that I want to try to defend these two common sense claims in terms of important implications that they have. In the first place, the continuity thesis that humans are similar to animals is, as Dr. Clayton has already indicated, a key thesis of Darwinian evolution. That human beings share a fundamental similarity with all other forms of life. And secondly, the discontinuity thesis is important because the claim that humans are different from animals in significant ways, I want to try to show that's sufficient to ground a concept of human dignity, because a concept of human dignity is based on that idea of discontinuity. So in other words, what I'm trying to do, if you notice, there's a theme in the introduction of the papers that have been presented here in the Biology and the God of Abraham series. It's an attempt to show consistency between traditional concepts like creation in Dr. Carroll's talk, teleology in Dr. Takacha's talk, and modern science. And what I want to do is show a consistency between a traditional concept of human distinctness and contemporary biology. There's an indirect objective that I have that I'm really not going to talk much about, but it's something we can talk about in the discussion if you'd like to. I want to address one reason why theists often regard Darwinism, the theory of evolution by natural selection, as foundationally problematic. Because what they often think is that Darwinism can't be true because it's incompatible with a traditional philosophical anthropology, a traditional view of human nature. We see a version of this in a quotation from the Review of the Origin of Species that was written by Bishop Samuel Wilberforce. If you've seen the movie Amazing Grace, Samuel was the father of William, so well-known figure in English politics. William Wilberforce was very active in the abolition movement, and his son was an Anglican bishop. But in his review, toward the end of that review of Darwin's Origin of Species, Wilberforce wrote, regarding the extension or application of the idea of evolution by natural selection to human beings, he wrote, quote, "Such a notion is absolutely incompatible with the whole representation of that moral and spiritual condition of man, which is the Word of God's proper subject matter. Man's derived supremacy over the earth, man's power of articulate speech, man's gift of reason, man's free will and responsibility, man's fall and man's redemption, the incarnation of the eternal Son, the indwelling of the eternal Spirit, all are equally and utterly irreconcilable with the degrading notion of the brute origin of him who was created in the image of God and redeemed by the eternal Son, assuming to himself his nature." So Wilberforce is claiming in this quote that a Darwinian conception of the continuity of species, the radical continuity of species, is inconsistent with Christianity. That's, in a sense, the question that I want to address. Now let's just briefly think about what is human dignity. In my view, human dignity is the assertion of human distinctiveness, and it's based historically, in terms of the development of a tradition, on two threads. First, that human beings are different from and superior to all other living things, primarily due to the power of reasoning or the capacity of rationality, in what we might call the human exceptionalism criterion. Now, in this talk, that's really the primary focus I'm going to have here. We're not going to so much talk about the second criterion, which is also important historically. It's the one that Dr. Clayton, again, has already referred to, the imago Dei, the view that humans reflect the divine image in a way unique in the created order. Of course, one of the implications of the discussion we had last night of Dr. Takacha's talk was that the created order as a whole reflects God's glory in various ways, but human beings, according to the Christian and Jewish traditions, uniquely image or reflect divine glory. This notion of human dignity develops independently in classical paganism and in Judaism and Christianity. And it's important that it's a shift from comparative social rank terms, a cluster of them in both Greek and Latin, and well, in Hebrew for that matter. Comparative social rank, when people are compared to one another in terms of how valuable they are. That's the origin, but what it comes to mean is an inherent value shared by all members of the species. And that's the key value, that's the key concept that's at issue when we think about Darwin's view that, that human beings do not have distinctiveness, that they are radically continuous with all other living things. Darwinian evolution seems to deny human distinctiveness based on Darwin's claim of the common ancestry of all living things, which is one of the key themes of The Origin of Species, published in 1859. The claim is that human beings are continuous with and kin to all other living things. Indeed, as Darwin suggests, the origin of all living things is from a few, or perhaps even one, original ancestor. And secondly, as Dr. Clayton has already mentioned, from the descent of man, Darwin makes the claim that the natural order is characterized by numberless gradations that involve differences in degree and not in kind, which means that there's no qualitative human difference with respect to other living things. Now, implicitly, Darwinism challenges the imago Dei, but it's in a different way. It's in terms of Darwin's account of how natural mechanisms replace the notion of divine creation. I'm very interested in that, and I can talk about it if you want, but that's not the subject of the talk tonight, so we'll keep moving here. I do want to say just a little bit about the historical development of views about humans and animals and their relationship with one another. If I were to make the historical claim that I want to make in fairly straightforward terms, it's that what we find is, from the earliest of human history and culture, the two theses, the continuity thesis and the discontinuity thesis, are both affirmed. And what happens is there's a historical movement to the early modern period when the discontinuity thesis is affirmed against the continuity thesis. That's the general claim I want to make. Let's just briefly go through some steps here. The prevalence of animism, of the view that all things in nature are full of spirits, suggests from the start that in our archaic human cultures there is an awareness of, an acknowledgement of the fundamental continuity of human beings with other creatures, indeed with all of nature. And the central importance of the concept of the soul, which we find in multiple cultures at multiple times, suggests that the principle of animation is the same, or at least very similar, for human beings and all other living things. So those are pieces of evidence in favor of the continuity thesis. Now I'm picking a couple of representative figures here to try to show how the continuity thesis and the discontinuity thesis are held in tension. And I purposely picked Plato because if we think of anyone in Western culture, in the ancient period, who we might think is a fan of discontinuity, it would be Plato. But surprisingly enough, Plato, even though in some texts, in some places, he will affirm the difference between human beings and all else of creation, it's interesting that in dialogues like the Phaedo, he suggests that this notion of the soul, of the commonality of life, suggests that there is a deep continuity between human beings and other living things. In the Phaedo, he even advances the very interesting idea of soul transmigration. He thinks of human beings as souls inhabiting bodies, but the interesting thing is that he believes that, or Socrates anyway articulates the view in the Phaedo, that human souls can transmigrate after death into non-human animal bodies. There's a passage in the Phaedo in which he actually says, depending on the kind of life you've led, if you've been non-philosophical, if you haven't engaged in activation of your philosophical capacities, but you're nice to other people, you might come back as a social creature like a bee or an ant. If you're cruel and rapacious, you might come back as a hawk. If you're a little bit on the stupid side, you might come back as an ass, he suggests. So it's possible. I never read this, and I tell my students when we read the Phaedo, I never know if Socrates is joking in these passages, to tell you the truth. But Socrates is at least offering the suggestion that that the same soul that animates a human being can also animate animals. So that's an affirmation both of human-animal continuity, and also in the fact that even in the Phaedo itself, Socrates makes a big deal about the unique and central significance of human rationality. So you could argue, self-contradictorily, he's actually asserting both human distinctiveness and human-animal continuity. Now I want to say a little bit more about Aristotle. He's an important figure because we're going to come back to Aristotle in the end. One thing you might have noticed from Dr. Clayton's intro is that St. Thomas Aquinas gets top billing in these talks of the Biology and God of Abraham series. I'm not going to say anything about St. Thomas, but I am going to say some things about Aristotle, whom St. Thomas regarded as so central that he was worth designating the philosopher. Aristotle also affirmed human-animal continuity and human-animal discontinuity because he thought of living things as arranged in a kind of hierarchy. And that hierarchy is determined by life functions. Simply speaking, it's divided into plants, animals, and humans, and the divisions have to do with functional capacities. Now you might say, okay, this shows that Aristotle is affirming discontinuity. But the interesting thing about Aristotle's claim here is that functional capacities that we find at the lower levels are also found at the upper levels. And so animals, for example, do possess faculties or powers that aren't present in plants, but they also possess plant life functions. Nutrition, growth, and reproduction are also present in animals. Animals, in addition, have the powers of sensation or sense perception, desire, and locomotion. Humans have all of those functional capacities plus a few additional ones, rationality, especially rational understanding and moral deliberation. And so Aristotle is at the same time claiming that all living things bear a fundamental relationship to one another, but also at the same time claiming that there are distinctives if we look at different classes of living things. And of course, Aristotle would say the same general analysis applies to particular species. If we want to think about the differences between a bat and an eagle and a jellyfish and a porpoise, right? We can come up with the functional capacities that distinguish them. Basic functions of life are common to all living things. While animals lack rationality, the capacity to understand causes, they have differing levels of sensation, memory, and experience. One of the things that's very interesting about Aristotle is that he was a very empirically oriented philosopher. What that means is that he was not only interested in theorizing, as we often think of philosophers as doing, he was also very interested in researching, in looking at animals, in collecting animals, in observing animals, and seeing what sorts of behavior they engaged in. Further, a central idea that we find throughout Aristotle's philosophy is this idea that I've already touched on in Plato, the idea of humans and animals, at least some animals, sharing a social nature. Aristotle frequently says that human beings we are polis-dwelling animals, is a literal translation of what he says. We are politikon zoon. And he says, in being social, we are like ants and bees and other congregating animals. So again, there are some deep continuities in addition to discontinuities. Now, I am going to skip a bit here, but we're going to find that the same kinds of ideas appear in Judaism, in the affirmation that human beings are created in God's image, but that they're created from the dust of the ground, and that they're part of nature even though they have sovereignty over nature. And we find it also in Christianity. And for example, a representative passage from 2 Corinthians where Paul talks about human beings as earthen vessels or jars of clay that nevertheless at the same time are exalted by our capacity as spiritual beings to hold or reflect the light and glory of God himself. So again, you see an affirmation of this both and rather than either or. The first known expression of the concept of dignity in the sense that I've been talking about it is articulated actually by an early Roman philosopher statesman, Cicero. And Cicero's assertion is that human beings, because of their faculties, again we can think it's in the spirit of Aristotle's philosophy, even though Cicero is more influenced by Plato than by Aristotle, but it's certainly in the spirit of human beings are part of nature, but we possess faculties that elevate us, and it's our responsibility to affirm and cultivate and develop those capacities, as he says in this passage here. If you take from the middle there, if we consider what excellence and dignity is in the nature of man, we'll recognize how shameful it is to be dissolved in luxury and to live in a spoilt and weak way, and how virtuous in a moderate, continent, severe, and sober way. So Cicero's point is not to deny our animality, not to deny our place in nature, but to assert that among animals we have capacities that elevate us above animals. Now there's an important shift that takes place. So we can see if we trace this, and I think I would assert that if we trace this into the medieval period in thinkers like St. Albert and St. Thomas, we're going to find similar assertions of continuity and discontinuity, that human beings are part of nature, but we're an elevated part of nature. Importantly, when we get to the early modern period, we find the rise of the machine model for thinking about nature. And of course, you think of the great figures here, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton. And the point is that in analyzing nature and thinking about nature, the machine model begins to become prominent. Now, the important implication of this, however, is that if physical nature is mechanical, then human beings must be qualitatively different from the rest of nature. What this leads to is something we find in early modern culture, the brute-human dichotomy. There's an increasing sense of the distinction between humans and non-human animals. Brutes or animals are mere mechanisms, while humans, even if their bodies are governed by the mechanical laws of nature, must be in some way thinking about humans and animals in the direction of discontinuity. Now, there's a thinker that is an obvious representative for this movement. It's Descartes, René Descartes, well-known early modern philosopher. His theory of reality is metaphysical dualism, which actually, we could say, substantializes this distinction between the mechanical physical realm and the non-mechanical mental realm. The power of the mechanistic model, though, even people that didn't adopt Descartes' dualism, I don't mean to suggest that everyone after Descartes became a dualist. That's not true, even though there were a lot of dualists. But the power of the mechanical model for nature meant that even those moderns who didn't adopt a metaphysical dualism, a theory of dual realities, tended to think of human nature and tended to think of human beings and animals in discontinuous terms, and tended also to think of human nature in discontinuous terms between the spirit or soul or mind and the physical body. Now, there's a key text that actually illustrates this for us. It's Descartes' book, The Discourse on Method, especially part 5, in which he summarizes key ideas from his unpublished book, Le Monde, which, by the way, he didn't publish because of the Galileo trial. He was a little worried that if he talked too much about heliocentrism, that he might get into trouble, so he just decided not to publish it. But in part 5, he summarizes some of his key ideas about human nature. And he engages in something that's really kind of interesting. I call it the machine or zombie thought experiment. He doesn't talk about zombies, rats, right? If you're thinking it'd be nice if he did talk about zombies. He doesn't. But he describes a zombie scenario. He says, imagine a body just like ours, except without any vegetative or animal or rational soul. Notice the three parts he's referring to Aristotle, right? So he's saying, imagine a human body with no animating soul. Could it be alive? His answer is, strangely enough, yes. He votes thumbs up for zombies. Because he has a mechanical model of physical nature. And he believes that the body functions in significant part in mechanical ways. He talks a good bit in part 5 of the Discourse on Method about William Harvey's discoveries in blood circulation. And his claim is we see that the body works as a kind of clockwork. It works as a kind of machine. And it would continue to function even if there were no soul or mind causally associated with it. Then he asks a question that really, you might say, follows naturally from the zombie test. How do we tell a zombie from a non-zombie? How do we tell a body that looks like a human body, but that has no mind or soul attached to it? In other words, how do we tell a mere physical mechanism from a living human being? And his answer is to propose two key criteria: the communication of ideas, we might say the use of meaningful language, and secondly, inventive interaction with the environment. And he explains this. This is a little bit harder to understand, but I think what he means is something like what we might call problem-solving behavior. The fact that human beings engage with our environments in ways that involve or engage our thinking. Now, he does use a negative criterion for explaining this. He says, what I mean is that human beings are not governed by the disposition of their organs, not governed by the dispositions of the organs of the body. Cheetahs run fast, but that's because they're built that way. Bats fly, but that's because they're built that way. Fish extract oxygen from a water environment, but that's because they're built that way. That has to do with the disposition of their organs. We can go fast and fly and go underwater, not because of the way we're built, but because we're capable of manipulating our environment to make those things possible. That's what Descartes has in mind. So those are the tests that give us ways of distinguishing between humans and animals. Now, there was an increasing theological skepticism and a move toward secularism in the 18th and 19th centuries. This is really an encapsulation of a whole lot of history that we would have to do if we had more time, but I'm just going to throw this assertion out there. And that had the effect of diminishing the imago Dei basis for dignity. And in fact, what we find is that in the work of philosophers like Immanuel Kant, there's a movement away from the two-legged grounding for human dignity based both on human exceptionalism and the Imago Dei. And what happens is that gets narrowed to that one criterion of human exceptionalism. And we find also that in the 18th and 19th centuries, increasingly the idea of dignity is articulated, and that means the idea of human distinctiveness, is articulated in terms of autonomy, in the capacity of human beings to govern themselves and to determine reflectively the principles of their actions. So again, what happens really post-Descartes, well into the modern period and into the Enlightenment, we might say, is again this heightening of discontinuity between humans and animals. Now in the 19th century, though, we begin to see that this discontinuity begins to be challenged, and challenges come from a number of interesting fronts. First, increasingly, Europeans are exposed to primates. That is, people capture apes and chimpanzees and bring them to Europe and sometimes display them. In one case, a primate was given as a gift to a monarch. And so people begin to see these human-like creatures, and it begins to chip away, you might say, at the notion that human beings and all animals are radically different from one another. And secondly, especially people in England and in the continent begin to think of principles of fair and humane treatment of animals. And we find that in such we find it in such things as the founding of the British Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in the early 1800s, and even if we go into the late 1800s after Darwin, we find it in an increasing sense in literature and popular culture about how animals deserve more fair and more humane treatment. For example, in Anna Sewell's famous novel, Black Beauty. I recently read it with my young daughter, and you'd be surprised if you've only seen the movie how full it is of, we might say, propaganda for humane treatment of animals. In a significant sense, that's really the message of the book. And so what's happening as we're in the lead up to Darwin is tentative qualification of this idea of radical discontinuity between humans and animals. We also see chipping away in the whole idea of slavery. The phenomenon of slavery poses a serious challenge to the brute-human dichotomy precisely because in European culture in the 17 and 1800s, a critical question is, are slaves human or not? They sure look human, but they're not treated like human. You can see how that raises a fundamental problem right there. Indeed, the slogan of the abolitionist movement was, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And this was the emblem of the British Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded in part by the family that Darwin married into, the famous Pottery family. And now I'm blanking out, I don't have it written down in front of me. The Wedgwoods, right, Wedgwoods, thank you, Dr. Clayton. And so the question here that's being asked in the abolition movement is, don't slaves belong above the line that distinguishes human from animals rather than below the line? And indeed, we find that the abolition movement gained steam in the late 1700s and early 1800s. I've already mentioned Samuel Wilberforce was that quote earlier. His father, William Wilberforce, was central in the abolition movement in the 1700s. And by the late 1700s, slavery was completely abolished in France. In the early 1800s, the slave trade was abolished in both Britain and the U.S., and by 1833, it was completely abolished in Britain, and then in the United States, of course, as a result of the Civil War in 1865. Also, we could talk a lot about this, but I'm going to have to just throw this out as something for us to think about. We also find the rise of Romanticism is in part a movement that explores themes of the place of humans in nature and the value of human emotions, which of course bears continuity to animals, given that we acknowledge that animals have emotions, and also of the animal dimension of human psychology. Again, I have a reference to before Darwin and a reference after Darwin, Mary Shelley's famous novel Frankenstein, which is about a mechanical conception of life, but of course it's really about deeper things than that. It's about whether we should think of life as mechanical and what that means. And then Robert Louis Stevenson's novel about, we might say, the human-brute dichotomy internalized in a particular human, the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. All right, this brings us to Darwin. Now, of course, Darwin's central claim is evolution. The natural world is characterized by gradual and constant change. The key and revolutionary claim that Darwin makes, however, is to offer a mechanism for the process of evolutionary change. That mechanism is natural selection, which asserts that processes of biological change are governed by heritable variation and conditions of competition and scarcity, which over time produce descent with modification, and ultimately, given enough time, significant enough accumulation of modification that we would assert that speciation has taken place. And as I've already mentioned, a key idea of this, an implication of the notion of evolution by natural selection, is common ancestry. As Darwin says in The Origin, in the concluding section, all living things descend from a few original forms and perhaps from, he says, some one prototype or some one primordial form, which means that all living things are related to one another developmentally or genealogically. One way we can think about what Darwin is doing and the way that we can see the challenge of Darwinian ideas to the notion of human dignity is in the claim that Darwin's objective is really to naturalize human beings, to think of human beings in completely natural terms. What that means is to think of us as being continuous with the rest of nature in terms of evolutionary processes, and also descriptively or analytically in terms of natural processes. And we can see really both of these assertions in various places of Darwin's works. In that concluding section of The Origin, he says, in the distant future, psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Significantly enough, this is the only passage in The Origin where Darwin says anything about human beings. He saved his arguments for human beings for the descent of man. But notice what he's saying is he's already, in a sense, laying down the card and saying human beings fit completely into evolutionary processes. Secondly, on this idea that human beings fit into natural processes, not only evolutionarily, but in terms of our own individual natures, there's a comment from his notebooks, which were written around the time of his Beagle voyage. He says, "Why is thought, being a secretion of brain, more wonderful than gravity, a property of matter? It is our arrogance, it is our admiration of ourselves." Notice what Darwin is doing. He's suggesting that if we want to understand digestion, of course, we should study the stomach. If we want to understand thought, we should study the brain. Because after all, thought is nothing more than a functional capacity. Indeed, we might even say a material secretion of the brain. Now, it's interesting, this is in his private notebook. Darwin is not always so materialist as this. He actually excoriates himself at one point and says in his notes, "Oh, you materialist," because he is thinking of human beings in materialist terms. What we have here then is, notice we've pendulum swung from the radical discontinuity of early modern to Enlightenment thinking. We've pendulum swung in the radically opposite direction to radical continuity, the claim that human beings and animals are essentially the same. And as Dr. Clayton's already indicated, this is the argument of Darwin's Descent of Man. He claims that numberless gradations across the hierarchy of living things provide evidence for the claim that it's possible that species might pass and be developed into each other. And indeed, what he does in the dissent, especially in the chapter on the mental faculties of humans and animals, is he tries to make the case that we can find rudimentary versions of human capacities in lower animals, and we can find vestiges of animal capacities present in human beings, for example, in the form of instincts. And so he runs through a list of features and argues that we find these points of continuity: sense perception, instincts, simple emotions, including terror, deceit, affection, and grief, complex emotions, by which he seems to mean emotions that involve a complex appreciation of one's situation. So jealousy, the recognition that you want something that someone else has and that you don't have. Intellectual emotions that involve the operations of our intellect: curiosity, wonder. The exercise of higher faculties: imitation and learning, attention or focus, memory and imagination. And finally, reason, which Darwin conceives of primarily in terms of judgment and problem solving. He gives some really interesting concrete examples of, for example, sled dogs that are walking across very thin ice and know to spread out, because if they're concentrated in one place, they'll break through the ice. Now, I would argue that this chapter, especially in The Descent of Man, makes the case for continuity and does so successfully. Does it make the case for radical continuity? We might ask, what are the implications of radical continuity? Well, interestingly enough, Darwin was aware of the possible implications of a radically continuous conception of humans and animals. In a letter that he wrote to a correspondent, he expressed this idea: "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?" Now notice the implication of this. If we wouldn't ask a monkey about their convictions, we probably wouldn't ask monkeys about, let's just pick something at random, say natural science, say perhaps the theory of evolution, right? However, human beings are able to engage in and do natural science. Darwin's suggesting, well, wait a minute, if human beings are really radically continuous with all other living things, it doesn't seem like we should be able to do what we do. There's something very problematic and puzzling about that. I think really Darwin is intuitively aware of the fact that genealogical continuity, the fact that humans share common ancestry with other species, doesn't guarantee functional continuity. Even if Darwinism is right as a theory of the descent of species from ancestor species, it's not a theory that shows us that the functional capacities of organisms are all going to be continuous with one another. Now, this is something that Dr. Clayton, again, I mean, you previewed my talk here, so Dr. Clayton alluded to in his introduction. What we need to talk about, this is a very technical point, again, I'm going to rush over it very quickly, but we need to acknowledge that even when things are made of the same stuff, and even if the processes by which they're made are the same, it doesn't mean that their functional capacities are going to be the same. Bats and fish and humans are made out of the same component elements, the same chemical elements. And indeed, we are constructed in very similar ways in terms of our skeletal structure and morphology and so forth. And yet, humans are able to walk on land, fish are able to swim and to extract oxygen from a water environment, and bats are able to fly. Why is that the case? Well, it's helpful to appeal to this notion of an emergent quality. Even if it's true that we're made of the same stuff, and the processes by which we come to be what we are similar, those structures that characterize humans and fish and bats are significantly enough different that we can do very different things. Bats are able to fly. Get ready for this, it's a shocker. Because they have wings. Fish are able to extract oxygen from a water environment because they have gills. We're able to walk on land because we have legs. So what this tells us is that a theory of form has to be understood in terms of, or has to be understood as informing the functions that organisms are capable of carrying out. Now we can talk more about that, but that's the basic idea of emergent qualities. I will say though, notice the last item on this slide. We often hear the fun fact that humans and chimps share 99% of their DNA. If you understand the idea of emergent qualities, your response should be a great so what? I've read, I wasn't able to check if this is true, I believe it's probably true, that humans and yeast share something like 70% of our DNA. And you want to say, so what? I mean, it's interesting. I'm not saying it's not important, that it's not an important part of biological research to find out about DNA continuity between different kinds of species. But if someone cites this as proof of the idea that humans and chimps are the same, or almost the same, it's a completely bogus piece of evidence and the argument doesn't work. I would hope someone who's taking critical thinking at Gonzaga would see through an argument like that. Okay, what about the post-Darwinian context? So where are we now in thinking about humans and animals post-Darwin? Interestingly enough, after Darwin, for various reasons, and there's a complex history here, but again, we're going to have to pass over it pretty quickly. For various reasons, intuitive, religious, philosophical, epistemological, scientific researchers from the time of Darwin to the mid-1900s generally accepted continuity of humans and animals, but not radical continuity. In other words, they would have said, well, yes, human beings are in significant ways like animals, but not in the radical sense that there's no difference between humans and animals. For all of those intuitive reasons that we've alluded to or appealed to already. After all, human beings are religious, animals are not. Human beings do science, animals do not. Human beings reflect philosophically, animals do not. Of course, we can keep going, but you get the idea. Now, a number of candidates were advanced for the idea of what is it about humans that makes us distinct. And the list would include something like this. I tried to be not exhaustive, but at least representative. Human beings engage in language or communication of ideas. We've already seen that in Descartes, right? Human beings are creative. We engage in problem-solving behavior. Again, that's Descartes' second criterion, right? But what about other ideas? Maybe it's that human beings engage in conceptual abstraction. Human beings are capable of self-recognition or self-awareness. Human beings use symbols. Human beings use tools, and not only use tools, we make tools. Human beings have an aesthetic sense. We appreciate beauty. Human beings are involved in complex social organizations. Human beings are involved in culture, and we transmit social practices. In a way, that's what culture is the system by which we transmit social practices. Human beings are capable of deception. That's actually Nietzsche's argument for human uniqueness, that we are capable of levels of deception not found elsewhere in the animal kingdom. And finally, that human beings are characterized by humor or play. Now, since the mid-1900s, there has been a shift. And if you ever watch NOVA programs or nature programs or read the popular press, you know about this shift. If I was to characterize it in a non-serious, non-academic way, I would characterize it as the animals are people too movement, right? To say that, well, Darwin was really right, and we really do need to move in the direction of acknowledging that there's no significant, essential difference between humans and animals. Now, what we've seen since about the mid-1900s is a trend toward making the case for radical continuity. And it's been motivated by a number of things. I think some of the motivations have to do with a sense that Darwin's argument for continuity and the descent of man wasn't fully appreciated or wasn't fully acknowledged. A trend in some areas of psychological research to think of humans in more mechanical terms. If you think about the implication of that is not to define animals up, it's to define humans down, right? To say there's no essential difference between humans and animals because after all, we're just biological machines exactly like they are. There's also been an increasing sense that standard ways to draw the line of human distinctiveness just don't hold. And I would refer back to that list that I just had on the screen a moment ago. And finally, a willingness to invest research resources on extensive empirical data gathering. In other words, some people would just say, I don't know, maybe Darwin's right, maybe he's not. Let's do some research on this. And so a good part of the research since the mid-1900s, I think, is motivated by curiosity. Let's find out more about animals. I might mention that we just had Jane Goodall as a speaker here at Gonzaga a week ago. And essentially that's her argument, is that she said one of the reasons why she was very curious about chimpanzees and primates is she thought maybe learning something about them will shed some light on ourselves. Maybe if we learn about them, we'll learn something. Okay? So it could just be a point of curiosity. Now there are a number of methodological problems about animal cognition research. Again, I think perhaps just because we're getting short on time, I'm just going to briefly summarize that the key problem methodologically with animal cognition studies is that we only have indirect access to the thinking or minds of animals through their behavior. That's the only way we can know what's going on in their minds, so to speak, if they have minds. And there are a number of angles of this. A famous version of this is Thomas Nagel's article, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? The argument that we can never, using objective analysis or observation, sort of enter into the subjective consciousness of another kind of organism. He gives the example of a bat, of course, because a bat's conscious experience using echolocation is nothing like our own experience of the world. And you wouldn't get it if you closed your eyes and made chirping sounds and wandered around the room. Sorry, it's not going to give you the experience of what it's like to be a bat. But another key problem is anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism, that we tend to project human attitudes and experience onto animals. If you have a pet, you probably do this all the time. Notice we not only do it to animals, we do it to inanimate objects. If you've ever yelled at your computer or whacked it on the side or yelled at traffic, right? Essentially you're anthropomorphizing something that is not animate. But there's we might say the contrasting problem is anthropocentrism. We have to realize that when we're trying to understand something about animal experience, we can't assume that animal experience is like our own. That's something you find most researchers emphasize this problem about anthropocentrism. And there are also practical problems about how research is structured in trying to understand animals. Okay, what are some of the recent developments in animal cognition research? The bottom line, I'm starting with the bottom line here on this point, is that many of the supposed functional demarcations between humans and animals have been shown to be problematic or false. Now, I suspect many of you have heard this. You've heard, well, animals use sign language, animals talk, animals create art. The fact is, some of that's true and some of it's not. But it's also the case that of that list that I had a moment ago, a lot of those supposed candidates for demarking human beings from everything else, they have at least been shown to be problematic. So for example, let me just summarize quickly a lot of points here. We find complex social organization, including cooperation and specialization in bees, ants, wolves, elephants, and primates, among other creatures. We find the capacity to learn, if by learning we mean acquiring new behavior by repetition and conditioning. And notice you might say, well, wait a minute, we don't use conditioning. If you are a parent and you have a child, trust me, you've used conditioning before. But we also find that animals are capable not only of learning, but they're capable of trans. What that means is when you have similar groups that are varied in their practices or behaviors, the durability of the practices that we find in those groups, and expansion of certain patterns of behavior to new members of the group. That's really what culture is all about. And we find that in examples like, this is primarily primates, but we find it in food preparation, nut cracking techniques, and food washing. And Gonzaga's own Mark Bodemer is involved in a research project that has to do with the way chimpanzees hold each other's arms when they're grooming. They like to pick bugs from each other. And what we find is they do it in different ways, and we find that certain behaviors are replicated in certain groups, which is, of course you want to say, that's a very primitive form of culture, agreed, but it is a form of culture. It's a form of acquired behavior that's then transmitted and preserved within a group. Surprisingly enough, we find that a number of different kinds of animals, wildly divergent across the animal kingdom, are capable of object identification. Pigeons, bees, this is really surprising, they can recognize alphabet letters, and of course chimpanzees. And even object classification or abstraction. We find some evidence that, again, this is primarily primates, are able to place objects into groups and to understand the difference between an instantiation and a group into which those instantiations fall. So for example, the famous chimpanzee Washoe, in research with the gardeners, was able to recognize individual food types and to classify them as food, banana, drink, and apple, and so forth, as falling under the category group. There's been evidence of self-recognition, including mirror self-recognition and the use of mirrors in great apes, elephants, and dolphins. Oh wait, I have object identification twice there. Okay. Object classification. Okay, wait, I just repeated that. Sorry about that. In addition to that, numerical concept application, a researcher named Sarah Boyson has gotten, and this is really pretty amazing stuff, has gotten trained chimpanzees to be able to count objects, to recognize how many objects there are, and to even use fractions. So she'll cut a banana in half and say, you know, here's a banana slice, what do I have now? And the chimpanzee's behind a little grill, and he points at a little 1/2 as the number now that represents the object. Okay, I have some repetition there, sorry about that. And of course, Descartes' first criterion, remember, was communication of ideas. An enormous part of animal cognition research over the last 50 years has been devoted to animal communication and animal language. And we find research on communication even again at a very low level with bees and the waggle dance that they use to signal direction of resources that are distant from the hive. But we also find, if we jump to primates, especially chimpanzees and gorillas, we find use of American Sign Language, we find abstract symbol communication, we find communication in a concrete social environment. Washoe and Kanzi, among other chimpanzees, were raised in an almost a human-like atmosphere where they interacted with their keepers as though they were like surrogate parents. And so Kanzi, for example, is able to respond to human comments in concrete situations like, Kanzi, go over and grab the pot for me and bring the potatoes here. He's able to understand that and respond and do that. And also, again, Mark Bodemer, in his dissertation research, did study of voluntary initiation of communication by chimpanzees. There was a controlled way of determining if the chimpanzees would come up to the researcher and essentially say, hey, I've got something to say to you. And they did that on a number of occasions. Okay, so I've already given you the preview bottom line. What's sort of the reflective bottom line? Methodological problems, especially the problems associated with moving from behavior to inferences about cognitive activity, they complicate animal cognition research. And also there are methodological problems, primarily having to do with anthropomorphism. If I gave you a really glaring example of this, I don't know if any of you know about Coco the gorilla. who has been made a semi-star by her researcher slash trainer, Penny Pattinson, I think is her name. If you do a Google search online, you can find Coco's internet conversation with, I think it was set up by AOL or something like that. But what you see is a researcher trying way too hard to make it sound like the gorilla is talking to us. There's no doubt that the gorilla is communicating in various ways, but what's interesting is if we just directly translate, and you can see it in the transcript, it's there. People keep asking Coco questions like, are you happy where you live? And Coco responds, banana. Are you happy where you live? Want banana. Coco, want banana. So Coco has something of a monomania for the things Coco is interested in. Coco can communicate, but it's at a very basic level. And the strange thing about that transcript is it ends with I'm not sure if it's Pattinson or if AOL at the bottom say that it was her birthday and Coco expressed the hope that people will become more active in defending the rights of animals before it's too late. And you think, wait a minute, didn't Coco want a banana? Defending animal rights. Okay. At the very least, though, as I've already indicated in my preview, many of the standard proposed criteria for human distinctiveness are doubtful or perhaps even false. However, one of the things that we find that's very surprising is people that have done enormous amounts of research with animals affirm human distinctiveness. And I picked just two representative examples here. I could have kept looking or kept filling the slides here, but representative examples. E.O. Wilson, famous ant scientist at Harvard University, makes a very interesting claim about comparing primates and extinct species of Homo, of the genus Homo to human beings. Quote, the growth in intelligence that accompanied this enlargement was so great that it cannot be yet measured in any meaningful way. Human beings can be compared among themselves in terms of a few of the basic components of intelligence and creativity, but no scale has been invented that can objectively compare man with chimpanzees and other living primates. No scale can be constructed. Jane Goodall was just here, and she gave a version of this quote in her public talk. But she says in her book, Reason for Hope, so very like our closest biological relatives, the chimpanzees, yet so different. She's talking about us, of course. A species evolved that was able to teach its young about objects and events not present, to pass on wisdom gleaned from the successes and the mistakes of that past, to make plans for the distant future, to discuss ideas so that they could grow, sometimes out of all recognition, through the combined wisdom of the group. Human beings are discontinuous with animals, even though we are continuous with animals. Now, how do we conceptually characterize our intuitive sense that human cognition is significantly different from even higher primates? How do we describe the difference that allows humans to not only recognize and name concepts, numbers, and abstract objects, which we've seen primates can to some degree do, how do we place them in reflective contexts that are unavailable to animals? The key idea that I want to assert as the takeaway that enables us to maintain both theses, the continuity thesis and the discontinuity thesis, is that human beings are capable of organizing our experience by reflective use of rational principles. And we have no evidence whatsoever that even higher primates are able to do this. For example, controversial article by a group of biologists in biology in behavior and brain science, very prestigious scientific journal, and they titled it very provocatively, Darwin's Mistake. You can imagine, well actually in the comment section, BBS is a journal in which there are official responses published alongside with a theme or key article. And one of the complaints that appears in more than one of those response articles is, guys, you really shouldn't have used that title. It's just going to rouse the, rouse the rabble. But what do they assert? They say, only human animals possess the representational processes necessary for systematically reinterpreting first-order perceptual relations in terms of higher-order, rule-governed relational structures akin to those found in a physical symbol system. Human beings alone are able to reflect on perception and experience with classical inferential role-governed domain-independent systematicity. Now, they developed this idea in a very technical way in the article, but I think we can get the basic idea. What they're asserting is that animals are capable of rich experiential lives. And I think we should acknowledge that. Animals are capable of, especially higher animals, are capable of rich experiential lives. However, they are not capable of prescinding from the immediacy of their experience of the world around them and reflecting at that level of principle on how to think about their experience. Now, strangely enough, in making this claim, I'm going to fast forward, jump ahead. I'm copying an idea now from Bill Carroll, who says, the title of his talk was After Darwin, Aquinas. I'm going to say After Darwin, Aristotle. Because I think Aristotle gives us the basic framework for understanding this, and it goes back to that the psychic hierarchy that I mentioned earlier. Let's start at the bottom. At the plant level, plants are non-conscious forms. They engage in non-conscious forms of biological interaction with their environment. That's what characterizes plants. What about animals? Well, of course, animals is a huge group. It encompasses a lot of different kinds of organisms. But roughly, we can say something like this. Animals are characterized by various levels of conscious interaction with the environment. Okay, a worm is barely conscious. By the way, Darwin wrote about worm consciousness and worm minds. A worm would be barely conscious. A primate is very conscious, right? Has a high level of consciousness. Perhaps even some degree of self-aware consciousness, although we're not completely sure about that. But various levels of conscious interaction with the environment, including with other organisms, that's the idea of sociality or culture. At the highest level, some organisms capable of memory can retain and compare their perceptions to gain what Aristotle calls empyrea, experience. Now, the basic idea of experience is it's what gives us rules of thumb for knowing how to act in the world. Does a lion have experience? I would say yeah. A lion knows, we have to use the word know here in a cautious way, but I think we should use it advisedly. A lion knows that antelopes tend to hang around the water hole. If you're hungry and you want an antelope, you go to the water hole, right? Now, that's not based on a scientific theory of antelope behavior by lions. No, it's a rule of thumb based on the lion's experience and its memory, and its capacity to retain its experiences in memory, to compare them, and to engage that memory in its current situation. What about humans? Well, humans are characterized by various levels of conscious interaction with the environment. We're all the same species, but notice we are awake and conscious and using our faculties at various ways at various times. In fact, a complaint of some philosophers, especially existentialists, is that we kind of sleep through our lives and barely pay attention to what we're doing. Is that possible? Well, yeah, sure, it's possible. Memory allows experience. So wait a minute, notice this, just as Aristotle said with functional capacities back in the psychic hierarchy, we would say humans are capable of that animal function of experience. Are we able to operate in the world by rules of thumb? Absolutely, you bet we are. Are we only capable of operating in the world by rules of thumb? No, we are not. Our rationality also allows the organization of our experience by rational principles, and this is what we would call understanding, such as kind concepts, temporality, cause and effect, and inferential connections. So we are deeply continuous with animals, and yet in a very important way, we are discontinuous with animals. It's a short video. I want to show this. This is Kanzi. It's going to work? No, it's not going to work. Maybe I'm not going to be able to show it. Oh well, it looks like I'm not going to be able to show it. Maybe this isn't formatted set up. Okay, I'll tell you about what happens here. This is a really interesting set of experiments in which Kanzi, I've already talked about object recognition and Kanzi's ability to respond in concrete environments. There's a test here in which an experiment in which the researcher Sue Savage-Rumbaugh gives Kanzi novel instructions. Do this, do this, do this, do this. And they're novel because the point is, can Kanzi understand how to add together nouns and verbs in new ways? And the first one she asked Kanzi to do in this video is, Kanzi, give the doggy a shot. There's a stuffed dog there. I don't know if you can, I don't think you, it's the blob over on the right. You can't quite tell it's a dog. And there's a syringe there. Very strange. I mean, this is pretty impressive. Kanzi looks around, picks up the syringe, pops off the cap, and sticks the syringe into the toy doggy. Very impressive. And Sue Savage-Rumbaugh asked Kanzi to do several other things. But the kicker is, she asked Kanzi, put the keys in the refrigerator. Kanzi looks around on the floor. In fact, I think you can see, well, no, they're right under his hand. The keys are there. And the fridge is right behind him. Put the keys in the refrigerator. So he looks around, finds the keys, opens the fridge door, puts the keys in, closes the door. Now, the reason I think this is really interesting is an illustration of human capacities is a 3-year-old child will protest if you ask him or her to put keys in the refrigerator. Why? Keys don't belong in the refrigerator, right? Now, what does that show? It shows that even at a rudimentary level, human beings are capable of stepping back from our experience and reflecting on the meaning of objects within our experience and showing, well, and understanding the proper use. And this is really kind of striking to me because chimpanzees are able to use keys in the right way. They know that keys are, in a sense, for something, namely to unlock locks. But chimpanzees don't understand that keys are not for putting in the refrigerator, or at least Kanzi doesn't in this case. So, final point. I think that we can show that traditional concept of human dignity, of human distinctiveness, is consistent with a Darwinist outlook, because even if human beings are continuous with other living things, even if we affirm the continuity thesis, at the same time, I think we can reasonably and justifiably affirm the discontinuity thesis. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
Yes, there's a Dr. Calhoun that wrote a book, The Goddess and the Alphabet, and I wonder if you're familiar with that?
Never heard of it.
Okay.
Can you ask a question about it? I'd be happy to try to say
The idea of the bicameral mind. So the human being has a bicameral mind, and his thesis is that there was a time when we did not have a bicameral mind, and he uses the Bible as the first and best evidence of the bicameral mind coming into play, and people began language. And his thesis is it happened all over the world independently of anyone else.
Okay, well, I would, because I'm an Aristotelian, broadly speaking, I would say that when we look at any functional capacity that human beings have, I should clarify this. Aristotle has a theory of soul, but we need to understand that his theory of soul is not a theory about a ghosty immaterial thing. For Aristotle, the soul is the formal cause of a living organism. In other words, it goes back to what I was saying about flying and breathing oxygen from a water environment. We have the capacities we have because we're structured in the way that we are.
So
And
the
so,
bicameral mind is something that Adam and Eve had.
well, I'm not sure about that.
Well, we have to assume that human beings have been human beings since God made them perfect and said they were good.
Okay, well, that depends on how we want to interpret Genesis. I myself think that we should interpret Genesis as making a claim. I would actually refer back to Dr. Carroll's talk and say that Genesis is an account of the absolute dependence of all of reality on God. That's the key idea. As to how God created human beings, whether it was by independent acts of special creation of Adam and Eve, or if it was by creating a natural order that would developmentally allow the emergence of organisms like ourselves, that's an open question.
The thing about Calhoun is that he says that there was a point in time when the bicameral mind developed in all races in all parts of the world, pretty much the same. And he said the Bible is the best evidence of it, because the first book in the Bible with writing that is its own writing is the Deuteronomy book. And so Adam and Eve didn't have a language. Everything's been oral transmitted up to a certain point, and
Well, I
then
had a
language
even if
appears.
it wasn't a written language.
So it's oral tradition.
Yeah.
Okay, so then Josiah is the child king, and Elijah is having to deal with the prophets that kept coming to town and wanting to say, do this, do that. So he says, let's build a fire, we'll water ours, you try and get your God to light up your fire. When you are through
You
with
said
dancing
Josiah, I
around,
think you're talking about Elijah and the prophets
yeah.
of Baal.
And
Yeah,
so they
okay.
murder all those guild prophets as they continue to come.
Okay.
And then Josiah takes over from his father, and
All right, this is interesting, but I don't see how it's connected to my talk.
the actual priesthood class for the Hebrews in the land of milk and honey have to try and educate this young Josiah. And they say, we were dusting around in the tent. There was no temple. And we opened the box, and guess what? There's a scroll in there. Would you like us to read it to you?
Okay, can we talk about humans and animals, please?
Okay, well, I'm just saying, the thesis is, with Shalene, is that the first book of the Bible written has got to be based on the Deuteronomy story, and then everything else before has to be caught up.
Again, that might be really interesting, but I don't see how it has anything to do with humans and animals.
Okay.
Do we have another question? Mr. Reynolds, go ahead.
In looking at your two theses, continuity, discontinuity, one of the strengths that we see in a stronger account of continuity in as far as contemporary implications, we see something like in Peter Singer, where we see greater respect for something like animal liberation.
Right.
We see a stronger emphasis on some of these ethical type of implications coming from a radical continuity conception. What do you see as some of the implications for the human-animal ethical relationship by revitalizing part of the discontinuity thesis?
Well, I think we should, as a Christian who affirms the notion of dignity, I think we should say that human beings are distinct, but of course that doesn't mean that human beings should treat the created order with contempt. And so, while I think there are very problematic implications of Singer's way of thinking about. There's a common view in environmental ethics in the direction of what you're talking about, where we think in terms of the enlarging circle of ethical concern, where we stop thinking of only humans and we extend concern to wider and wider circles of we might say primates and humans and animals capable of sensation, and then we might say all life, and we might say the entire cosmos, right? That's actually fine as an argument. I would argue, though, that it runs against the force and value of human dignity. This is a really complicated argument, but the simple version of this would be dignity is a value that works, that has its force by distinctiveness. And if we think of ethical value in terms of ever-widening circles to the point where we include everything, we might have an ethical theory, but I think what we've done as a result of that is we've eliminated the concept of dignity. Now, interestingly enough, contemporary ethical theorists who are working with a Darwinian framework would agree that what happens is dignity is destroyed. In part, what I've tried to do is say not necessarily. It is destroyed if you take the radical reading of continuity and you dispense with the notion of discontinuity. But I think there's a cost to that. Now, let me just, one little point about this. The idea of human dignity seems to have largely dropped out of ethical discourse around the time of Darwin, actually. Now, there are people who still use the concept, but they use it in very fragmented and unsystematic ways. What's interesting is the concept gets reintroduced into ethical discourse at the end of the Second World War. The idea is regular concepts of autonomy and fair treatment and rights are insufficient to handle the kinds of large-scale human abuse that we saw in World War II. And further, we see an extension of the concept of dignity in the 1960s in medical ethics. And so my argument is we need the concept. Shouldn't we figure out a conceptual foundation to give it grounds? If you keep extending if you take, like you said, if you radicalize the continuity thesis, it seems to me you lose dignity. Some people are willing to lose dignity. I think it's a high cost to pay.